Hello, so we're continuing on the human computer interaction course by looking at foundational principles and focusing pretty heavily on the requirements gathering steps. So let's get to it. All right, so the primary rule of all digital design: you are not the user. You may be a user, but you're not the user. This is kind of an outgrowth of the false consensus effect. So as humans, we have a tendency to overestimate how many people agree with us and our opinions and underestimate the number that don't. We tend to think, we're the main character of every story and our opinions are the right ones. But it's important to fight against that, especially in design. When we're designing something, we can become fairly attached to it, and it's important to not do that because you're never going to design something perfectly out of the gate, and your users are going to contribute to your design more than they'll detract from it. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Users guide design, not designers. So we'll go into requirements pretty heavily in this one. So there are different categories of requirements and different names for all of them. But to give you kind of a broad overview, there are technical requirements. These would be core requirements or limitations, constraints of your system. Legal or regulatory requirements. So, for example, if you're designing an application, you may be subject to accessibility guidelines that are derived from the Americans with Disabilities Act, things like that to keep in mind. Functional requirements, so these are aspects of your design that your users will interact with or how they will engage with your product. Contextual design, also known as environmental, where we will capture the general state of the world that your product will live in and what context you need to be aware of and design for. And finally, your user requirements, which will be should be the guiding force of your design. So here's a pretty famous animation or cartoon, I guess, of a typical customer design or product design lifecycle. It's fairly humorous. It's been done countless ways. If you look up tree examples of digital or of just design, you will find a pretty big handful, I guess, of these type of aspects. But take a moment and pause if you need to and just step through how this happens, and keep in mind as you're going through this, assume that all of the people that are engaged here are trying to do their best. They're not trying to build something poorly or to deliver something negative for the customer. They're doing the best they can with the information they have from their requirements that were given to them. But this will really capture kind of all the different aspects of a project and finally focus on what the customer actually needed, which can often be the most difficult part of our requirements gathering process. So in a similar method here, looking at perspectives and stakeholders. So as a designer, you have to be aware of the different stakeholders and perspectives that are going to be involved in your project. Your job is to take the perspectives and stakeholders at hand and guide all of that energy into developing a good product and good design for your users that considers all of those aspects. Now, when we look at establishing user requirements, we focus on what do users want, what do they need. Sometimes this can get reframed. Maybe you don't have any users yet. You have an idea for an application and you're just going to look at what's the problem you're trying to solve. Similar process. Your requirements will often be this process of establishing requirements will often be extremely iterative. Sorry about that. Hit the scroll on my mouse. Maybe that's a bad design. Who knows? but you will need to iterate on your requirements with those stakeholders that are involved and your users. And it will often take several discussions and meetings to really kind of nail down what those requirements need to reflect. And your requirements arise from your user needs. They can be justified and related to data that you've collected. They don't necessarily have to be. Just depends on your system, what you're trying to do. And the requirements drive the design. They help develop the shopping list, so to speak, or the checklist of what you're going to be building. Now, I captured a lot of different types of requirements earlier, but as we look at it, there's other perspectives that group all the requirements into either functional or non-functional. Can be a valuable perspective as you're going through. Functional requirements. So these are going to be what the system should do, what functions should it offer, and so when you're looking at what functions the system should have, that's going to be backstopped, let's say, by the data or information that needs to be present to achieve that function. Non-functional aspects are more somewhat indeterminate, or they're not going to be as driven per se directly by your users, but they're actually more important for your users' perception and acceptance of your product. So here's an example. Having a button to log in is a function your system should offer. The response time of that button and of that function that it's driving in the code will ultimately have a greater impact on whether or not your users are positively viewing your system than the design of the button will. That's a big drive behind a lot of interaction design focused folks, where they're looking at specifically, hey, it's not just the visual design or even some of the processes that you've architected. It's how do those processes work within the system, and how do those interactions break down. So those are important aspects to consider, because they will have they'll have outsized, it'll seem, impact on your user's perception of your system. You can have the prettiest app in the world, but if when the users hit the buttons, it takes 30 seconds for them to respond, no one's going to use it. So you definitely have to balance those. So environmental or contextual requirements, we're looking at the environment that the system will be used in, or the context of use. So for especially anybody building applications for folks that are in the trades, if you're looking at you're building an interface for some digital system that a mechanic might use, mechanics often have dirty hands. They're in loud, not super well lit environments, so you have to consider those aspects in your design. Those also might drive technical requirements, right? Of, hey, we need a brighter screen to be able to capture the contrasts we need. The context of use, it could be a social context, so that means you're going to need to build in interactions and functions that enable those social factors. Organizational, let's say you're building an intranet or some kind of an internal thing, or even let's say you're a government, you're working on a government project and there needs to be some citizen interface. There may be additional requirements, focuses from your IT department, or those kind of expectations. So you have to be aware of those. Now, the other thing I want to call out is your environmental and contextual requirements can often manifest as a core understanding of the why of your product, the why it exists. Because typically applications or systems that are being designed are trying to solve some problem in the real world that comes about as a result of some context. So that's another way to think about these. So when you capture these requirements, reflect on that and see there might be novel aspects of your product that you hadn't considered, but when really digging into the environmental and the contextual aspects, that kind of reveal themselves. Now, the next few slides, we're going to be going through some different, I would say, design methodologies, design processes. A lot of them will overlap from like a philosophical sense, but they just differ in terms of focus or process or any of those aspects. So don't take any one of them as gospel. They're all valuable, and each of them may fit into a design situation you find yourself in better than others. So they all can be valuable. This one is the usability engineering lifecycle, very popular, famous one from Mayhew. I won't go through every box here. Feel free to pause if you want, but this essentially captures it in a structured architectural flowchart way to step through the phases they've identified as requirements analysis, your broader design, testing, development phase, and then your final installation or delivery phase. So this is one area that it's important to focus on, especially if you're working in a more engineering-driven organization. This might better map to some of the processes you're working on in parallel. So again, can be valuable, might work for your process, might not. Just use it as needed. Next, the Voliere requirements template. So this is another method about developing requirements, capturing them to ensure that you don't miss any requirements. This is incredibly valuable for more complex systems that you might have competing requirements or different stakeholders that sometimes they won't perfectly mesh, but you can capture their needs and then kind of disposition them as you go through the process. Here's an example of the Voliere requirements template kind of in action. So with that template, you can hopefully capture all the necessary requirement types. You can then build in these use cases. These can be used to develop scenarios for testing or different other evaluation measures. But what this really also helps, especially when you're dealing with a more complex design, is once these are all completed, all these requirements are written up, you can actually take them and use them as your final test guidelines for your system, and to ensure that you're meeting all of the requirements of your users or your technical needs or any of those aspects. So very systematic and rigorous and super helpful for more complex systems. But even if you feel like your system's not complex, pay it some attention, because it could be valuable for your product in other ways. And next, the goal-directed design methodology. So this is a heavily human-centered, focused process from the interaction design community. I pulled this from the textbook About Face by Alan Cooper et al. And there are other examples of it, but it breaks down into different phases than, let's say, the Voliere or the usability engineering lifecycle will, but could be more valuable or beneficial for your process or what you're working on. Also, if you're focused more on interaction design over standard user experience design, I know some folks will say that interaction design is user experience design. Fundamentally, there's a lot of opinions about the ever-shifting definitions of all of our job titles, but it's a very valuable reference to look at and to ensure that you're just trying to develop a design that works for your users' goals. So another question here is, how do you arrive at the correct requirements? So how do you know when you've gotten to the end of it? There's a lot of different methods and opinions on this, on the proper way to do it. Some folks, for example, will say that surveys are completely pointless as a user data gathering tool. I tend to think that all tools can be useful, and if your surveys aren't super helpful, maybe you're bad at writing surveys, or you're using them in a way that they're not effective. There are certain things we just don't use surveys for. But ultimately, the way you know when you've kind of done a rigorous, thorough job is like any other scientific endeavor. You hypothesize and test, and you iterate. Just not even just on your prototypes. You iterate on your user interviews, on your user engagement, your user research. You continue to kind of go back until you think you've captured everything, and you won't. You'll miss things in your design, which is okay. But as long as you're taking an approach to building a successful product for your users and for their needs, you'll catch enough that it'll be valuable, and maybe you can improve it over time. So here we're going to look at different data gathering methods for a few slides. There's a lot of different methods out there, and there's a lot of different definitions of the methods. For example, I have interviews here. You could have semi-structured interviews, structured interviews, completely unstructured interviews. You could have think alouds. There's countless different ways to do this. So, don't get precious about any one particular method. They're all tools that are helpful, but interviews are great for exploring different issues, walking through different scenarios, but they can be costly for the team or for the project. They're time consuming. Everything from actually running the interviews, the time it takes to do it, and to classify the data you get, it can be kind of burdensome. Focus groups are just an extended aspect of that, right? We just have group interviews, but some of the problems you need to watch for is you have to have a really good facilitator to ensure that you don't get, dominant personalities just kind of taking the whole group as they go. That's one of the ways I don't tend to prefer focus groups, just because I like one-on-one interviews better. But again, there are definite times where the focus groups are the right choice. Questionnaires. So we talked a little bit about surveys, right? You're going to use them in conjunction with other techniques, sometimes to validate assumptions or to try to get an understanding of how important something is. And they're good for collecting a large amount of data from a large amount of people, as long as you have a good delivery mechanism, and you keep it short. Especially in this day and age, people are not going to sit down and engage with your survey for 10 minutes. So, make it as punchy as you can. Studying documentation. This is one that a lot of UX designers, especially in some of the commercial fields, don't really think about as much. To be fair, a lot of times they're developing applications where there probably aren't documentation things you can go to. But if you're in a space where you do have some, definitely dig into that. You can't functionally expect to design or redesign a system or process without understanding how it got there. That's kind of my approach is, I have to understand, I have to build it up before I can break it down. So the benefit of documentation, especially if you're in a industrial or like safety critical space, procedures, rules, all these things are often written down. They're a good source of data for the steps in an activity. We'll get into other structured methods to break down a task, but these can be a good baseline. They can also help you understand the why. How did we get here with these things? I bolded here that one of the most important things about studying documentation, it does not include a time burden on your stakeholders, typically, or on users. This is usually a group of designers digging into some documentation and trying to map those into different requirements, but you don't have to engage your stakeholders or users for that. So again, can be a way to achieve a little bit more efficiency in some of these steps. But you also can't design it something just off of documentation. So at some point you're going to have to engage your stakeholders and users, but keep that in mind. Then looking at observational and kind of surrogate product type interaction. So we obviously can do direct observation. This is really common when you do think alouds are my favorite method for some of this, but you can just have a designer sit behind your user and watch them do what they're doing and don't say a word. Don't influence it. Just try to note it, note everything they do. You can also achieve this through screen recordings, eye tracking, those kind of aspects. Indirect observation, so this is where you might have users do kind of some self reflection type things where they're looking at what they're supposed to be doing and noting it. Can be useful depending on your use case there. And then researching similar products. So this is one that won't, that has incredible value from a few different angles and doesn't typically involve your users. So if you are building a system or an application, it's almost certain someone's built something very similar. Nothing is new under heaven and earth and all that stuff. But looking at similar products can help you capture opportunities. So maybe there are pain points in those products that you can solve. That product's already out of design and has been delivered. So making changes to it has an inherent cost of changing the way the system works for existing users. So capturing any unsolved, let's say, pain points can be super valuable. It also can help you capture design inheritance. We'll get into that in a little bit, but design inheritance will be a huge factor in your digital design process and something you need to be aware of. But yes, other similar products can be super helpful. I mean, if you go out and you look at 10 different applications that all do similar things, find the things they all do, because then there might be a consistent requirement of that use case that requires that. So going into primary aspects and metrics of any HSI design. So this, when I list down here different metrics or methods, they're not exhaustive. But these are kind of the big 4 aspects of any HSI or HCI digital design, whatever you want to refer to it as, that you need to be aware of. First, your user experience. This is going to be something about the user satisfaction. Do they like using your product? Does it help them feel positive or any of those things? If you're working in an industrial or more safety critical space, you may not care as much if your operators like what they're doing, but still it's important to keep in mind people are more successful using products they like to use. And some examples, right, we'll look at user research surveys, get qualitative feedback, and did they have success on the tasks as they're using the system. Those are kind of some metrics we'll use. Usability, this is just like it sounds. It's how usable your system is. We will use certain metrics like time to completion, error counts, abandonment, if they abandon a task or a path, and pathing accuracy. This is also incredibly important for more complex systems where they're going to be stepping through different fields or different situations. Then information architecture. Some user experience designers will groan when they hear about IA getting involved, but it really it can be incredibly important to pay attention to depending on your use case. So your information architecture is going to be how your information is structured and how your users will discover it. And sometimes your users expect things to be in places that you didn't expect them to be, so you don't put them there, and then they waste time searching around for something that they need. I would say the relevance of information architecture increases linearly or even exponentially with how complex the system is. So Don't slough it off. And user interface. So this is an important part. I know I'm focusing a lot more on the process than on the visual design of things, but your user interface is still incredibly important. It's how your system's going to communicate with your user, and how your user is going to communicate with the system. So it's important to kind of design inheritance. So we've talked about this a little bit before. What design inheritance fundamentally is the concept of when other designs you inherit other design features because your users expect it. So especially in the modern ubiquitous computing space, what we're running into is that all devices have some kind of an experience and an HSI structure. So what does that mean for all of us in design? Your system, application, whatever, will need to align with user expectations, which can now be defined anywhere and everywhere. So that means for example, there's a reason that home buttons on web pages tend to be in the same place. And what that really means is that when you're looking at novel digital systems, when you're looking at building something completely new and you're going to break from those standards, you can, but you have a higher bar to clear. It either needs to be so much simpler, and these aren't like hard and fast metrics, but it needs to be some order of magnitude simpler than it would be with the current paradigm in order to make it valuable for your users to actually switch and change that process. So if you are doing something novel, you have to cope with, you're going to have a higher learnability curve. You're going to have to be more intentional about how you guide your users towards a novel path. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind. And, some folks might feel it stifles design and binds us to certain requirements. And maybe it does. But that's kind of how we have used it. That's why when you see, sometimes folks will have to do a design task where you have to redesign a shopping cart or redesign a hammer or something. And those are really difficult to do because they have been iterated significantly, but also the use of those tools is ingrained in us in a way that can be hard to override. And looking at mappings and affordances. So this will become a common thing. We'll come back to it, but mappings and affordances are very common are very common things we look at when we're looking at industrial design. So the famous examples, the Norman door, right? Bar handles are not a good affordance or a good mapping because it isn't clear for the push-pull thing, where the flat plate, you can only push it. You can't pull on it. Well, at least not easily. So you have to kind of consider those aspects. And they're incredibly important for all design. Now, the one thing that's weird, though, is what does that mean in a digital world? If mappings are typically driven by the physical reality of it, of what we're doing, well, in the digital space, we don't have that. So we have to find ways to hack those kind of cognitive shortcuts that we've all taken, all the heuristics that we've built up, and kind of capture that. So here's an example of it appears to be an application where you've got some automated lights. And so looking at this, your affordance is the button itself, but you don't have anything physical to map that affordance onto. So you have to be clever with your signifiers to communicate the use of that function to your users. And I'd say this is one of those areas where design can be extremely validating and creative, where you can find unique ways to signify things. So especially when we get into like visualization and those things, you'll see that a lot. So next video will be on methods. See you next time.